Have you ever, stopped to wonder why the fundamental numbers of our universe are exactly what they are?
Right, like the speed of light or, the mass of an electron.
Exactly. Think about it for a second. If you open a physics textbook, we just sort of accept these numbers as facts of life. In
Mm.
standard science, they're treated as, well, just arbitrary givens, just raw inputs that you measure in a lab, plug into your equations, and move on.
And honestly, it is one of the most persistent frustrations in modern physics. We treat these values as empirical parameters. I mean, we know what they are with staggering precision down to dozens of decimal places in some cases, but there is no underlying first principle explanation for why the electron weighs what it does rather than a little bit more or a little bit less.
Right, we just assume they're the hand we were dealt. But today we are taking a deep dive into an incredibly ambitious paper that proposes something radical, like what if they aren't random at all?
Yeah, it's a fascinating premise.
The paper is from May 28th, 2026 by Chiang-Kai Chen, titled A Unified Spectral Architecture of Emergent Constants. And our mission today is to unpack this framework. Chen is arguing that mathematical constants, things you might remember from geometry class like pi or the golden ratio, and physical constants like the masses of subatomic particles actually originate from the exact same underlying mathematical structure.
And the implications of this are just massive. I mean, it attempts to address a historical divide that has existed since the dawn of modern science. Historically, mathematical constants and physical constants have lived in two completely different conceptual universes.
Right, because mathematical constants like pi or, Euler's number E, they just arise naturally from pure logic. If
Exactly.
you draw a perfect circle anywhere in the universe, you get pi. It's an inevitable consequence of geometry. But physical constants, like the mass of a quark, don't emerge from pure logic in our current models. There's no perfect circle you can draw that suddenly reveals the weight of a proton. You just have to, well, build a giant particle collider and measure it.
Which means they have no theoretical origin story. But Chen's paper proposes something called the unified spectral architecture. It introduces a single, surprisingly elegant equation to explain both domains. The equation is C equals S times G to the power of N.
Okay, so if you're trying to picture this equation in your head, we can break down the variables pretty simply. C is the emergent constant, the final number we see in reality, like pi or the speed of light. S is a scaling factor based on powers of 10, which I promise we will dive into later because it is a wild concept.
Oh, it really is.
And then G is a recursive generator, acting as the sort of fundamental engine of the equation. And N is just an integer state, basically a whole number power, like 1, 2, 3, or negative numbers, like -1, -2.
The generator G is really the heart of the system here. It takes a fundamental seed value and recursively multiplies it, scaling it up through positive whole numbers or, compressing it down through negative whole numbers.
When I was reading through this mechanism, the best analogy I could come up with was tuning an old school analog radio.
Okay, I like that.
Under the traditional way of thinking, physical constants were just random bursts of white noise that could theoretically exist anywhere on this infinite continuous dial of numbers. But Chen is arguing that they aren't random noise. They only exist at very specific structured frequencies or spectral states on that dial.
That analogy actually maps perfectly to what logicians call a logarithmic space.
Yeah.
Constants are no longer lonely parameters floating in a void. They're structural fixed points. They represent the stable, resonant frequencies of a recursive system.
So if this equation relies on a fundamental engine, this generator G, what exactly is generating the math side of things? Like if I tune my radio to the math station, what's the frequency?
In the mathematical domain, the paper identifies the generator as the square root of phi being the golden ratio. So for math, G equals the square root of phi.
The golden ratio, the exact same proportion we see in like the spiral of snail shells, the arms of galaxies, and ancient Greek architecture.
The very same. The paper demonstrates that this specific generator creates a continuous geometric scaling system. It extends from something called the Fibonacci-Pythagorean-Kepler sequence.
Okay, that is a very dense title.
It is a mouthful.
For anyone who isn't a geometry buff, think of this as a master sequence that combines the famous spiraling growth of Fibonacci numbers with the rigid angle geometry of Pythagorean triangles. It merges continuous growth with structural geometry.
Right. And when you expand that master sequence, using the square root of phi generator, scaling it up with positive powers and down with negative powers, an entire spectrum of numbers emerges.
And when Chen actually maps this out, this one single generator matches over 100 known mathematical constants with incredible accuracy.
Yeah, mostly above 98% accuracy.
Which is wild. The paper lists them out in these massive data tables, something called the Copper ratio, which is a proportional constant related to polygons matches at exactly 100%. And the big hitters are there too. Pi, Euler's number, they all align beautifully within this sequence.
Because it creates a logarithmic numerical ladder. It's demonstrating that these famous mathematical numbers aren't isolated independent discoveries. They're literally runs on the exact same recursive ladder.
Now, I was reading this and I had a moment of serious skepticism.
Oh,
Yeah, I was looking at this infinite sequence of integers from positive infinity to negative infinity. If you have infinite whole number powers to play with, aren't you eventually going to hit every single number out there? Like, if I throw infinite mathematical spaghetti at the wall, eventually a noodle is going to stick to pi.
that's a completely fair assumption.
Yeah.
If the system allowed for infinite unconstrained searching, you would be absolutely right. But the author provides rigorous data on the statistics and symmetry of the spectrum to prove it is not a random scatter.
How so? Because infinite numbers usually mean infinite possibilities.
Well, the matches are highly concentrated within a specific resonance window. Specifically, they cluster tightly between the integer states of 6 and -60. Once you move outside of this specific window, the spectral density drops dramatically.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The stable approximations just stop showing up with the same frequency, so it works within a highly constrained active zone.
Okay, so the spaghetti is only sticking to one very specific highly active tile on the wall.
Exactly. And the structure of that tile is highly ordered. Within that active zone, there's an approximate 67-step periodic return behavior.
Like a wave structure.
Yes. The 67 values from n equals 6 to n equals -60 are structurally very similar to the 67 values before and after that range. It's a constrained cyclic wave. Certain index numbers possess an enhanced generative capacity, creating distinct resonance peaks where these constants preferentially emerge. So it's highly ordered, not just an endless numerical distribution.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So we have this continuous recursive framework generated by the square root of the golden ratio, and it maps out our mathematical reality, which leads to the massive pivot in this paper. If this continuous generator describes math, can the exact same logic apply to physical matter? Does reality follow a generator?
It does, but it requires a fundamentally different engine. If mathematical constants belong to what the paper calls the phi spectrum, physical constants belong to the ternary spectrum. For the physical domain, the generator G is the square root of 3.
Wait, why does physical matter need a completely different generator? Why doesn't the golden ratio work for a proton?
Because mathematical space and physical space have different organizational requirements. The phi spectrum is associated with continuous recursive geometry. You can always draw a smaller circle. But physical matter, governed by quantum mechanics, is quantized.
Right, physical reality isn't a smooth gradient. At the subatomic level, energy and mass come in distinct, indivisible chunks. You can't have half a photon or a third of an electron.
Which means you need a discrete generator. The ternary generator, the square root of 3, exhibits much more discrete, quantized spacing between its states. It naturally generates the hierarchical, chunked behavior we see in physical matter.
Let me try another analogy here. If the mathematical phi spectrum is like a fretless violin, allowing for continuous smooth slides between any possible note,
Right.
and the physical ternary spectrum is a piano keyboard. It has discrete, separated keys, perfectly suited for distinct physical particles.
The piano keyboard works well, but with one catch. The keys aren't evenly spaced like they are on a physical instrument. The ternary generator hierarchically spaces them out, creating clusters of distinct values.
Okay.
And the evidence for this discrete clustering is staggering. The paper demonstrates that this ternary spectrum aligns with the masses of all 15 standard model particles.
All of them. The building blocks of everything we can see and touch.
All of them. And the accuracy is mostly above 95%. It correctly places the top quark, the electron, the Higgs boson, directly onto these discrete piano keys. For instance, the top quark sits at the integer index of 1. The electron sits exactly at index 3.
That is wild.
But the deeper insight here is the underlying pattern those indices reveal. When you analyze the integer states assigned to these particles, they show clear hierarchical clustering. The paper explicitly points out a 2+1 index clustering pattern.
Yeah, I found this part of the framework absolutely fascinating, but it takes a second to wrap your head around. Walk us through how that 2+1 pattern works.
Okay, take the subatomic particles that make up the stable, visible matter of the universe, the up quark, the down quark, and the electron. If you look at their integer states on the ternary spectrum, they sit at -7, 7, and 3.
Okay.
So you have two related symmetric numbers, -7 and 7, and an offset third, the 3, a 2 plus 1 triplet.
And that matters because that mirrors the actual physical structures we already observe in reality. Because a proton, which sits in the nucleus of an atom, is composed of exactly 3 quarks, 2 up quarks and 1 down quark. It physically relies on a 2 plus 1 organization.
Exactly. The implication is that this physical hierarchy inside the proton isn't some biological or cosmic accident. It's a direct downstream consequence of the recursive logarithmic structure of the ternary spectrum itself. The math dictates the physical assembly.
It is a little mind-bending, honestly. The physical architecture of the stuff making up your own body right now is mathematically mirrored in the spectral state of its tiniest components.
Yeah.
But that leads us to a pretty massive puzzle. If we have all these discrete piano keys generated by the square root of 3, are there physical particles for every single key on the board?
The paper is very careful about this nuance. Not all ternary spectral indices have a known particle attached to them.
So there are empty piano keys.
There are unoccupied states falling right within the active spectral range. This tells us that physical realization is highly selective. The universe is not an automatic conveyor belt churning out a piece of physical matter for every available mathematical slot.
Which begs the ultimate question. If we have a math spectrum, the fretless violin, and a physical spectrum, the discrete piano keys, and not every piano key gets played, what actually determines which keys do get played in the physical universe? How does the universe decide what becomes real?
The rendering of reality happens at the intersection.
Intersections of the two different spectra.
Yes. The paper defines something called a discrepancy function, represented by the mathematical symbol delta. Think of delta as a measurement of the mathematical difference between a specific state on the phi spectrum and a specific state on the ternary spectrum.
So it's basically measuring how far apart a math frequency and a physics frequency are at any given point.
Right, and Chen's data reveals that physical realization happens preferentially where the mathematical phi spectrum and the physical ternary spectrum perfectly overlap. It happens where the difference between them, the delta, is practically zero.
Wait, so you're saying reality basically only renders where the math generator and the physical generator come into perfect agreement?
Think about acoustic resonance. If a singer hits the exact right frequency, a wine glass will shatter because the sound wave emitted perfectly matches the natural structural wave of the glass. They amplify each other through constructive interference. In this architecture, when the continuous math wave and the discrete physical wave perfectly overlap, when delta approaches zero, they create a structural fixed point strong enough to crystallize into physical reality. It acts as a cross-spectral filtering mechanism.
And it's not just random particles popping up at these overlap points. When delta is zero, we find the absolute heavy-hitting fundamental constants. The paper points out that the vacuum speed of light, the gravitational constant, and the fundamental charge of an electron all sit exactly at these low discrepancy intersections.
It provides a mechanical answer to a philosophical mystery that has plagued scientists for decades. Back in the 1960s, physicists started heavily debating what they call the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics.
Right. Why does abstract math, invented by human minds, perfectly describe the chaotic physical universe?
Exactly. Because under this framework, math isn't a human invention describing a separate physical world. They aren't separate domains at all.
That's incredible.
Both originate from this exact same recursive exponential architecture. Math and physics are two different spectral branches growing from the same root. Where those branches cross and perfectly align, physical laws emerge.
Okay, I see the elegance of this unified vision, but I have a major bone to pick with one lingering piece of the unified spectral architecture equation. The initial equation was C equals S times G to the power of N. We've covered C, the constant, we've covered the generator G and the integer state N, but we skipped right over S.
The scaling factor.
Right. The paper states that S is a scaling factor in powers of 10, meaning after all this beautiful recursive wave math, you still have to multiply by 10 or 100 or 1,000 to get the final numbers to line up with our real-world measurements.
Right.
You're telling me the underlying code of the universe just happens to use base 10. We only use base 10 because humans evolved with 10 fingers. That feels incredibly anthropocentric, like forcing the cosmos to fit human hands.
It is the most immediate red flag any scientist would raise. If base 10 is just a biological quirk of human evolution, Its presence here would invalidate the theory's claim to universality entirely. But the paper addresses this head-on.
Mhm.
According to the mathematics, base 10 scaling actually emerges naturally from the interaction of the two primary generators. It isn't an arbitrary human add-on.
How does base 10 naturally emerge? 10 is just a grouping convention we made up.
Well, look at the two fundamental generators themselves. The square root of 3 for physics and the square root of 5 for math. If you mathematically interact them, specifically if you take the square root of 3 to the power of 2 and multiply it by the square root of 5 to the power of 5, the result is approximately 9.99.
Wait, really? 9.99. I want to make sure I'm following you. You're saying if you literally just take the physics engine and multiply it by the math engine, it natively spits out our decimal system.
Yes. The number 10 is a composite structure formed directly from the physical and mathematical recursive engines. And the evidence for this structural relationship goes far deeper than that single equation. The ternary system, the square root of 3 system governing our physics, inherently codes for decimal structures when you invert it.
I remember staring at the fraction examples in the paper for a good 5 minutes. Walk us through how fractions prove this.
If you take the ternary base, 3, to the negative 2 power, that equals the fraction 1 over 9. The decimal expansion of 1 over 9 is 0.111, repeating forever. That links ternary inversion directly to recursive decimal behavior. And if you go higher, to 3 to the negative 4 power, which is 1 over 81.
This is the part that melted my brain. If you divide 1 by 81, the resulting decimal is 0.01234567 repeating. It is an ordered, infinite repeating sequence of literally every single digit in the base 10 system, perfectly in order. The only number it skips is 8.
Right. It produces highly ordered cyclic decimal behavior natively. What this suggests is that base 10 acts like a numerically efficient binary logic for magnitude transformation. Think about how modern computers use ones and zeros as a minimal symbolic state for complex operations. The recursive interaction of math and physics uses decimal scaling to efficiently shift magnitude while preserving the underlying spectral structure.
So multiplying by a power of 10 doesn't change the note on the piano keyboard, it just shifts the octave. And that octave system is structurally built into the interplay of the two generators.
Which ultimately forces a radical reinterpretation of physics as a whole. Take Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared.
The bedrock of modern physics.
Traditionally, we view that as a purely physical relationship between physical things. But through the lens of the unified spectral architecture, m, mass, and c, the speed of light, are physical realized quantities on the ternary spectrum. E, the energy, might actually represent a deeper mathematical object that emerges from the relationship across both spectra.
That reframes everything. Physical laws aren't just mechanical rules governing a lifeless universe. They are essentially mathematical theorems dictating how the continuous math spectrum and the discrete physical spectrum interact and resonate inside this giant logarithmic architecture.
Exactly. The framework replaces the traditional wave-particle duality with a much broader, more fundamental mathematics-physics duality.
We have covered a massive amount of conceptual ground here, so let's pull it all together. We started with the classic, slightly depressing view of the universe, that mathematical numbers are pure logic, but physical constants are just a random, arbitrary assortment of measured inputs. No reason, no rhyme, just the hand we were dealt.
A universe devoid of structural intent at its base level.
But Chiang-Kai Chen's framework totally flips that script. We've seen how a single recursive equation, using a logarithmic architecture, unites them. You have the square root of phi generator, creating the continuous mathematical spectrum, the smooth, fretless violin. And you have the square root of 3 generator, creating the discrete, quantized physical spectrum, the hierarchically spaced piano keys.
And physical reality selectively renders at the low discrepancy intersections, where the math and physics generators perfectly align and resonate, creating stable structures like the speed of light.
This should fundamentally change how you view the world around you. The next time you feel the warmth of sunlight, think about the speed of that light, or think about the mass of the countless electrons currently firing in your own brain, allowing you to process the audio of this deep dive right now. Those numbers aren't random. They aren't cosmic accidents. They are highly stable, resonant, fixed points in a recursive math equation. You are literally made of math, physically rendering where the frequencies overlap.
It is a profoundly unifying lens through which to view existence.
But to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, remember earlier when we were talking about the discrete keys on the physical piano? We mentioned that there are unoccupied or unrealized spectral states, empty keys on the cosmic piano that fall right within the active resonance zone.
Right, mathematical states that are structurally stable, but currently have no known physical particle attached to them.
The paper's future work section hints at something incredible regarding those empty keys. If we now know the underlying architecture, could a systematic search of those specific empty low discrepancy states provide a literal treasure map? Could those silent frequencies on our cosmic radio dial be the exact coordinates for undiscovered particles, dark matter, or entirely hidden sectors of the universe just waiting to be tuned in?
The architecture doesn't just explain the matter we have already found. It might provide the exact mathematical coordinates for where we should look next.
Keep your ears tuned to the static. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.